Commander Precon decks are a great way to dive into the format, giving you a complete, ready-to-play deck right out of the box. They're a great tool to gain insight on how you can begin building a Commander deck if you've never built one before, and many offer new and exciting strategies with each new set release. Once you've played your new deck a few times, you'll likely want to upgrade the deck. Refine it, tweak it, make it more unique to you and your playstyle. In this series, we'll be taking a look at each of the Commander Precon decks, taking a deep dive into the nitty-gritty and examining which cards work, which cards are duds, and which new cards you should look into adding in from your collection. My name's Flynn, and welcome to the Commander Precon Upgrade Guide, Bloomburrow Edition. In this video, we'll be breaking down the Peace Offering deck, a green, white, and blue deck that focuses on group hug strategies as well as +1/+1 counters. Group hug decks can be somewhat tricky to pilot as you're giving your opponents value, and while some come with added benefit from you, you sometimes have to play by giving yourself the shorter end of the stick until your payoff comes through. This deck seeks to address that by including a +1/+1 counter strategy in order to maintain your own board state while you spice up your opponents. Our main commander is Miss Bumbleflower, perhaps my favorite name in all of Magic. Cue the heavy metal music. She is a 1/5 rabbit citizen for 1, a green, a white, and a blue with vigilance. Whenever you cast a spell, target opponent draws a card. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, it gains flying until the end of turn. If this is the second time that this ability is resolved this turn, you draw 2 cards. This is a really interesting commander. Unlike other commanders, Miss Bumbleflower really wants you to hit that sweet spot of casting 2 spells per turn so you can draw those 2 cards. If you're only able to play 1 spell per turn, you do get to put a +1/+1 counter onto a target creature, but only your opponent gets to draw cards. This can also be done on any player's turn, so you could, in theory, draw up to 6 cards per turn cycle should you have the spells to do so. You do also have ways to abuse this power, which we'll get into later on, but playing Miss Bumbleflower does come with a good learning curve. You are giving your opponent's card advantage as you extend your board state, and only upon you casting that second spell do you gain any value outside of the counters and flying. There's no additional benefit to casting additional spells past the second. Ms. Bumbleflower's ability only gives you card draw upon the second spell that you cast. So even if you make it up to 4 or 6 spells in one turn, you're not going to get to draw anything additional. Mr. Foxglove is our backup commander and is 5 mana for a 3/5 Fox Rogue with lifelink. Whenever Mr. Foxglove attacks, you draw cards equal to the number of cards in the defending player's hand minus the number of cards in yours. If you didn't draw cards this way, you can put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. This one is super spicy. Mr. Foxglove offers us conditional card draw, and really helps as a means to level the playing field. If you're behind on cards and need to draw some, you can attack the player who's got a larger hand than yours. The more cards they have in their hand, and the less cards that you have in yours, the more cards you'll draw. This also has some unique flexibility in that you can deliberately attack a player with less cards in their hand than you have in yours, which would then result in a card draw count of 0, allowing you to cheat a creature into play. This would require a bit less proactive play, as you'll need to hold up cards in your hand to ensure that you draw no cards when this ability resolves. You also would want to include cards that are good to cheat into play. I think for this commander, you would want to add in some bigger creatures that would make for a better playoff when you're putting them into play for free. Now, for the sake of this upgrade guide, we are going to maintain Miss Bumbleflower as our commander, though we may cover Mr. Foxglove at a later time in a separate video. In this next section, we're going to take a look at the best cards that are new to Magic from this particular deck. These are some of the cards that we will want to look to maintain in the deck as we begin to upgrade this list. Bloodroot Apothecary is a 3/3 Squirrel Druid for 2 and 1 green with Toxic 2. When it enters, you and target opponent each create a treasure token. Whenever an opponent sacrifices a non-creature token, that player gets 2 poison counters. Talk about dishing out the friendship here. This card effectively takes group hug friendly fun time and turns it into Mario Party. A player who's accumulated 10 or more poison counters loses the game the next time state-based actions take place. This also puts a damper on aggressive treasure abuse, enabling you to get out treasure tokens to your opponents without worrying too much about the parity granted. Cards like Dockside Extortionist and Smothering Tides are incredibly popular cards in Commander, and this will curtail too much treasure use at least somewhat. Communal Brewing is a 3-drop enchantment. When it enters, any number of target opponents each draw a card. You put an ingredient counter onto Communal Brewing and then an additional counter on it for each card drawn this way. Whenever you cast a creature spell, that creature enters with X additional +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the number of ingredient counters on Communal Brewing. This card is so much fun. This hits all the targets for this deck. It enters and allows as many opponents as you'd like to draw a card, and then this gets an additional counter. Then any creature that you cast after this will enter with X +1/+1 counters. These counters can be proliferated as well, making it easy to add some extra spice to the brew and make your creatures bigger. Just don't add Mayor Lewis's shorts to the brew, please. Jolly Gerbils is 2 mana for a 2/3 hamster citizen. Whenever you give a gift, draw a card. This is my favorite card in all of Bloomburrow and quite possibly now all of Magic. I love hamsters, and these little furballs bring card draw on them. We have a number of cards in Bloomburrow that give a gift as a sort of kicker cost. If you promise a gift to a player as you cast the spell, you get an additional benefit, or a stronger version of the ability, and your opponent gets something like a creature token or card draw. Whenever you fulfill one of these gift-giving abilities, you can then draw a card with the gerbils. I want to see more of these gifts, as these are not only a good stat line on an adorable card, but an actually good ability as well, so I do hope that gift-giving becomes more relevant in the future. Long River's Pull is actually one of those gift cards. For 2 blue mana, you get an instant that counters target creature spell. You can also gift your opponent a card, where you promise an opponent a gift as you cast this spell, and if you do, they draw a card before the other abilities resolve. If the gift was promised, instead you simply counter target spell. So if you let your opponent draw a card as you look to counter their spell, you can counter any kind of spell, but if you don't, you are restricted to just creature spells. It's an interesting counterspell, and it doesn't feel like it carries the same energy as a normal counterspell. That feel bad of countering a spell is mitigated by their ability to now draw a new card. Maybe I'm too nice, but I do love this card. Octomancer brings another gift-giving season. For 5 mana, you get a Frog Druid 3/3 with Gift an Octopus. As you cast the spell, you can offer an opponent the gift of an 8/8 Octopus creature token. And at the beginning of each end step, you create a token that's a copy of target creature token that's entered the battlefield this turn. This is fun since you make the token as it enters, and at the end step, you can then technically give the opponent a second 8/8 Octopus. That really can bring up some unique table politics, as your opponent gets 16 power on the table, under the conditions that your goodwill comes with some protection. Perch Protector is yet another gift card. This one brings a 6 mana instant with gift an extra turn. Whew! But you create 4 2/2 blue bird tokens with flying. If the gift was promised, all permanents you control phase out, and until your next turn, your life total can't change and you gain protection from everything. You then exile Perch Protection. We have Teferi's Protection at home, and I actually really like the card for the additional benefit it gives. We are very much more into a white-leaning deck given the extra white mana pip in the cost, and the higher mana value means that while it's not as powerful as Teferi's Protection, it's still a good card that will offer you protection through a turn cycle that might chance a player winning the game. You can also give an opponent who might be behind an extra turn as a gift to help them catch up while you are phased out. It's important to note that with this card, that the turn order will still be maintained as the card's ability plays out. You can gift a player an extra turn between your turn and the player whose turn would normally be regularly after yours, and what this does is just squeeze them in their additional turn before resuming the turn sequence. Tempt with Bunnies heralds the return of the Tempting Offer mechanic on a 3 mana sorcery. When you cast this spell, you draw a card and make a 1/1 rabbit token. Then each opponent may also draw a card and make a 1/1 rabbit token. Then, for each opponent who does, you draw an additional card and make a 1/1 rabbit token. This is silly and I am all here for it. Tempting Offered cards are generally tricky to use as opponents can deliberately decline just to deny you the additional value you would get out of it, but sometimes getting an extra card draw and the rabbit token might help them get back into the game, so you can leverage this card to your benefit. 20-Toed Toad is a 3/3 frog wizard for 4 mana. Your maximum hand size is now 20. Whenever you attack with 2 or more creatures, you put a +1/+1 counter onto the 20-eyed toad and draw a card. When it attacks, you win the game if there are 20 or more counters on it, or you have 20 or more cards in hand. This card is such a fun alternate win condition. It's able to take advantage of some greedy card draw engines in Commander. We do have quite a bit of card draw in this deck, and we can always add in more, so getting to 20 cards might seem steep, but it is doable. This card does lack protection, so you will need to protect it with counterspells and removal should you be almost at that threshold. It's also a wizard, and so a deck like Azami Lady of Scrolls that draws cards as basically its gimmick would love to have this as a win con. In this next section, we'll be discussing some of the better reprints included in this deck. These are the cards that you'll also likely want to keep in the deck, as they'll offer you the best head start as you build it up. Sunscorched Regent is a 4/3 dragon with flying. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, you put a +1/+1 counter onto the Sunscorcher Regent and you gain 1 life. This card is pretty good in this deck. It grows larger the more spells your opponents cast, and while it might be a bit expensive at 5 mana, it will grow long term into a potential win condition. Flying is an underestimated level of evasion, and so you could just swing in unimpeded at an opponent with no blockers and take them out. Forgotten Ancient is one of my favorite cards, especially in this deck. Whenever a player, including you, casts a spell, you may put a +1/+1 counter onto the Forgotten Ancient. Then at the beginning of your upkeep, you may move any number of +1/+1 counters from the Forgotten Ancient onto other creatures. This card is such a passive value engine. Each player will help you build up a store of counters, and then you could shift them over to something like the 20-toed Toad, make it huge, and hasten us to our win conditions. This also plays similarly to our next card, Managorger Hydra, a 1/1 for 3 with Trample. Whenever a player casts a spell, you put a +1/+1 counter onto the Hydra. This is simple, but it will grow larger, and having Trample means some of that damage could possibly run through to threaten life totals. You can move over the counters onto the Forgotten Ancient and put them onto the Managorger Hydra to make it even more large, and swing out for a ton of damage. This moving of counters also plays nicely into the Simic Ascendancy. This 2-drop enchantment gets a growth counter whenever you put a +1/+1 counter onto a creature you control. At the beginning of your upkeep, if there are 20 or more growth counters on the Ascendancy, you win the game. See, while this deck does a lot of things to give the table benefits and value, we do also have a few passive ways to win the game. We are putting +1/+1 counters onto our own creatures with Ms. Bumbleflower and various other sources, and as we build them up, we have a number of ways to win on our own without having to strong-arm our way through the value that we've given our opponents. Psychosis Troller is a tried and true favorite of mine in group hug decks. This creature's power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards in your hand. Whenever you draw a card, each opponent loses 1 life. This can make card draw lethal. It pinging each opponent rather than just one opponent makes this card extremely relevant. When upgrading this deck, if we choose to lean into more card draw effects, this card only becomes more potent as you'll get that trigger far more often. Chasm Skulker gets a +1/+1 counter on it whenever you draw a card. When it dies, you get X 1/1 blue squid tokens with Island Walk, where X was the number of +1/+1 counters that was on the Chasm Skulker. This card is such a good investment for our +1/+1 counters, as we can eventually get a large swarm of 1/1 tokens later on. Illusionist Gambit is an old favorite from my Feldergriff deck, and is an instant for 4 mana that can only be cast during the declare blocker step of your opponent's turn. You remove all attacking creatures from combat and untap them. After this phase, there is an additional combat phase. Each of those creatures attacks this combat, if able, and they can't attack you or planeswalkers that you control that combat. Basically, this is the trading card version of Stay Off My Lawn. If an opponent swings out at you, after you've given them gifts and everything, the audacity, you can use this to say, you're fine to attack again, but you have to pick a different opponent. Now, one stipulation with this card is that if your opponent has had creatures that were not declared attackers in that previous combat phase, they could still use those creatures to attack at you. But again, this is a great way to protect yourself from an alpha strike otherwise. An Offer You Can't Refuse is a counterspell for 1 mana. You counter target non-creature spell, and its controller creates 2 treasure tokens. This works very nicely with the aforementioned squirrel, as those treasure tokens do tend to be a little bit toxic while it's in play. Hoofprints of the Stag is a 2-drop enchantment that gets a hoofprint counter on it whenever you draw a card. You can pay 3 mana during your turn, remove 4 hoofprint counters, and create a 4/4 flying elemental token. This is a neat way to get bodies on the ground or air should you need more. So you've played the deck a number of times and you're wanting to upgrade the deck list so it flows better and works better for your playstyle. We want to maintain the deck's original game plan, and so while you can absolutely take this deck in a different direction, we're going to keep the main strategy in upgrading this deck. We're going to be adding in 15 cards and removing 15 cards. We're not going to worry about our mana base in this deck, but we're going to be focusing on improving the spell package. For your convenience, in the description of this video, we'll have a link to a Moxfield package with all of the cards that we discuss here. Dreamtide Whale has a proliferate trigger whenever a player casts their second spell each turn. Our goal is to play 2 spells per turn, and so getting this off on our turn will help us crank up those +1/+1 counters and keep the whale in play an additional turn by giving an additional time counter. Dusk Legion Duelist gives us card draw whenever we put a +1/+1 counter on it, though it only triggers once each turn. This can still be triggered additional times on our opponent's turn, giving us additional counters each cycle. Edric, Spymaster of Trest, is one of my favorite old school group hug cards, offering card draws to opponents for attacking at each other. Edric doesn't give card draws to any player who attacks its controller, so if you control Edric, attacking you doesn't give benefit. Glunch the Bestower lets you choose a player at your end step. They put 2 +1/+1 counters onto a target creature they control. Then you choose a second player who draws a card, and then a third player to make 2 treasure tokens. This gives a lot of group hug value to the table and would be something to help foster some goodwill to help protect you. Incubation Druid and Kami of Whispered Hopes are both mana ramp that benefit from getting +1/+1 counters we dish out. I decided to maintain the 2 core strategies in this deck and include some cards that will benefit from those strategies. These 2 will give us extra ramp as we bulk up the +1/+1 counters on them. Kutzil Malamet Exemplar protects you from your opponent's spells on your turn. Whenever one or more creatures you control with power greater than its base power deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. We're on +1/+1 counters as a pretty big facet to our strategy, so if our big creatures connect, we'll get to draw a card as well. The Council of Four gives us a card whenever a player draws their second card during their turn. Whenever a player casts their second spell during their turn, you create a 2/2 Knight token. This gives us some value from our opponents getting card draw on their turn. If they have their own card draw in play, we'll benefit it with some card draw of our own, and their spell slinging can potentially give us a creature token. Crawl Space protects us further by limiting our opponents to only attacking us with 2 creatures per combat. One of the things that group hug decks tend to struggle with is keeping opponents off of our back. Yes, we are giving them card draw and value to help them play a consistent game, but that doesn't always curry us favor, and they still may attack at us, and this is insurance to that end. Howling Mine and Temple Bell both offer us some additional card draw, and are classic card draw in group hug strategies. I added in both Ghostly Prison and Propaganda. They aren't exactly exciting cards or adding anything unique to the strategy, but as mentioned before, we do sometimes need some more protection from opponents' attacks, and these 2 offer us some nice deterrence. Ominous Seas is one of my favorite blue enchantments, letting us build up to make ourselves an 8/8 Kraken token. This also has cycling in case we don't see ourselves getting much use out of the card. Finally, a card that has gotten quite a bit of hype from Ms. Bumbleflower, Psychic Possession, an enchantment aura that enchants a player. You skip your draw step, but whenever the enchanted player draws a card, you may draw a card as well. Ms. Bumbleflower now has a permanent target on whoever is enchanted with this. We will draw a card whenever that enchanted player draws a card, and so we can direct any and all targeted card draw to that player, so we can reap some extra value as well. Now, of course, we do have to make cuts to get these 15 cards in. My goal in these upgrades is swaps is to lower the mana curve and make more effective card choices and possibly add more ways in to win. If you play the deck and you find that some of the cards here work better to your own playstyle, feel free to continue using them. These are just my choices and cards that I'm either not a fan of, or I don't think synergize well enough with the deck, or in playtesting don't live up to what I think their role in the deck is. I think that this deck is a great entryway into Commander, giving you the building blocks to a unique take on a group hug deck that can actually win. One of the larger problems with group hug decks is that they can be difficult to pilot. You're deliberately enabling your opponent's game plan by giving them card draw and value, and unless you're able to develop a board state to combat that, you might get run over. I think this deck does a good job in giving you threats to keep on play, while also giving your opponents value. And at the end of the day, how you develop your deck is entirely up to you. But for now, that will wrap up our look at the Peace Offering deck. What do you think of this deck? Are there some fun tech cards you'll be slotting into your build? Let's talk about it in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, likes and shares are the best way to help our channel's community grow. If you're new here, subscribe and ring the bell to never miss a future video. As always, I appreciate you hanging out with me here today, and I'll catch you all next video.